Hey, thanks for watching my review and rating of the Buffalo River Trail. I did a through hike of the Buffalo River in early April and really enjoyed it. This video is going to cover the metrics of the trail, how far I went each day, what the elevation was, what I liked about the trail. Each day I had a struggle, so I'll talk about the struggle of the day. I actually put out a video earlier that covered the entire trail. It's an uninterrupted video of the through hike. You can link to that here. And I'd really love it if you watched it. Subscribing and liking videos help them move up in the YouTube rankings so more people get to see them, and I'd appreciate it if you chose to do that. Also, commenting is a great way to give feedback on what you liked and didn't like about my videos, so my next one can be even better. So I'm going to recap the trip, the 3-day trip. Day 1, we took a shuttle to the trailhead. It always makes me nervous setting up a ride with someone that you don't know, but they were there on time, and I'll give you the information about the shuttle drivers at the end, because I would encourage you to use them. I thought they were great. They had great stories to tell us beforehand. They checked to make sure we had all the right gear. And then lastly, which I thought was really nice, is in the middle of the trip, they actually texted to make sure that we were okay. So I think they were great, and I'd encourage you to use them. So day 1, get to the shuttle. We're going to do Boxley to Ponca. It's 2,057 feet of elevation, and the mileage was 12.21. So I want to preface that with saying I'm using my GPS for those measurements. Obviously, the official distance of the trail and the elevation of the trail is going to be different, but that's what I did. Maybe I did side trails or backtracked or went the wrong direction and turned around and go back another way, but that was my mileage. So we got to the trailhead, and actually the very first thing you do is cross the street, and then the very next thing you do is cross the river, or cross the creek. So we crossed the Smith Creek, and it's actually a perfect beginning to the trail for telling what we were going to go through the next 3 days. We crossed many creeks. Some of them you could just rock hop, and some of them I take my shoes off for crops to go across. So I just loved the first day. Was just awesome. I was so surprised at how many waterfalls there were, how many cascades of water, and the unbelievable color that the water brought to the trail at pre-spring, or maybe early spring before the flowers were really blooming. There were a few flowers out, but not a lot. But the water really brought a lot of character to the trail. Saw a deer. That was the wildlife for day 1. The only really complaint I had is on one section of the trail, approximately mile 6 to 9, had a large outslope. An outslope is basically where the trail is sloping away from the mountain that you're on, or the hillside that you're on, so that the water so the water will drain away, and it needs to be there. But I felt like mile 6 to 9 it was extremely sloped, and it really caused a lot of pain in my ankle. So that was my only complaint. It was a very challenging day. There were 3 large climbs, and 2 were pretty steep, and so most of that 2,000 feet of elevation came in 3 uphill climbs. So I'm also in these videos, I'm going to give my struggle for the day and my favorite spot of the day, or my favorite thing of the day. My struggle for the day was being sick and the outslope that I mentioned earlier between mile 6 and 9. My favorite spot of the day was the campground. I was not feeling good. I was sick actually all 3 days, but the surprise at the beauty of the trail really took my mind off of it for the most part. But by the end of day 1, the sun was going down pretty close to going down when we got to camp, and I was ready to be done. So that was my favorite spot of the day, but there were plenty of other favorite spots. So day 2, we woke up, we camped just past Ponca. We woke up 8 and then headed to Kyle's Landing. So the second night we stayed just before Kyle's Landing. Elevation on day 2 was 2,041 miles, and total miles covered it was 9.52, so slightly less than the day before. Unique features on day 2, besides the water that was prevalent throughout the trail, and there were waterfalls all through section 2 as well, but it went through a lot of moss-covered boulder fields. We had mountaintop views of the river, and they were just majestic and beautiful. You could see the canoers like little ants floating on the water down there. And then the struggle for the day. This is kind of funny and kind of not funny, but my backpacking partner left his tent poles at the first campsite. So we rigged part of his tent up, and he slept in his tent basically laying on him other than his face the whole night. That was really sad for him. I did feel bad. And then my favorite spot of the day, and probably might have been the favorite spot on the whole trip, was Beach Creek. It was just beautiful. We sat there for 45 minutes for our water bladders to fill, and I was actually shocked. I've always used a first need pump, which is kind of heavy, but it takes about 5 pushes on it and it fills a liter. It takes about 2 minutes and works really well, but a little heavy. So I bought a Sawyer gravity filter this year, and I don't know if I'm doing it wrong or if it just takes that long, but it was 45 minutes to fill 2 2-liter bladders. I'm probably going to invest in something else for the next trip. Sitting there at Beach Creek, water rushing down with their feet in the creek, beautiful day, was just perfect, and I loved it. I could have stayed there probably all night, but we had a lot more miles to cover. So because of the tent situation for Steve, we hiked 17 miles the third day. The plan was actually to have a fourth day, but I before I even got out of my tent, I knew what I had to do, and that was suck it up and hike 17 miles. The mileage was still a lot. It was 2,575 feet, so it was actually more than day 1 and 2. But 2 things: one, it was over a lot more miles, and 2, there weren't any stretches that were as long as the stretches on the first 2 phases. So it really wasn't bad. We trucked through the 17 miles, I think, at a pretty good clip, and still enjoyed most of the trail. I think the key points on day 3 were variety. There was tons of variety. You had mountaintop views, you were in the valley, you were going through boulders, going through pine forest, going through hardwood forest, and I really thought, if I had to say anything about section 3, it was just that it was very varied, and most of the non-trail activities were in phase 3. So there were a lot more views of the river at a lower level, where sections 1 and 2, mostly you saw the river from fairly high up. You got some really close-up views of the river, and the bluffs were very pretty. There were 2 cemeteries from the 1800s, which were pretty cool to see. Tombstones, and to know they'd been there for well over 150 years. And then the homestead that was also built in the 1800s, and was really cool because you could go in it and look around. Seems like most places like that, because of liability, they don't let you look at that, up close and in person. So that was pretty cool. The struggle for the day, I would have to say, was wanting to see everything, but knowing I had to hike 17 miles to the end. So while we got to experience the cemeteries and the homestead, it was a very quick trip through them. And so my favorite spot of the day was the Cherry Grove Cemetery and the homestead. Both of those were really nice additions to the trail. I really enjoyed the homestead and being able to tour through something built in the 1800s. Hope you enjoyed my recap of my through hike, and next is the trail review. So now I'm going to rate the Buffalo River Trail on my 10-point trail review. And these are features that are important to me. Others may rate differently or care about other things, but these are the things that matter to me on a backpacking trip. And they basically fall into 2 different categories. I hike for the physical challenge and for the beauty of nature. And so all 10 of my rankings are within those 2 categories. 3 of them are related to difficulty, and I use the NPS difficulty rating for distance and elevation, and then I also look at terrain and exposure. And then 7 of them are related to aesthetics. So how beautiful is the trail? Does it have unique features that other trails don't have? Is it secluded? Are there camping locations? And I don't necessarily need a campground or a specific campsite. Are there places that are flat and conducive to camping? How much wildlife there is, the availability of water, and then trail maintenance and marking are the final 3 in the aesthetics category. So the difficulty, I use the NPS difficulty formula and realize that I hike for the challenge of the trail. Some people may not hike for that and may rate difficulty differently, but to me, typically, the more difficult, the better. And their formula, the NPS is National Park Service, their formula is basically the square root of the distance in miles times 2 times elevation, which sounds corny, but it does give you a way to compare trails and the difficulty of them. So based on this formula, they have the following ratings. Easy is anything less than 50, moderate's 51 to 100, moderately strenuous is 101 to 150, strenuous 151 to 200, and very strenuous is anything over 200. Day 1, that calculated out to be 224, which is a very strenuous hike. Day 2 calculated out to be 197, which is a strenuous hike, and day 3 calculated out to be 296, which is very strenuous. Then I applied the formula to all 3 days for the whole trip and took total and divided by 3 and ended up with 239, which is a very strenuous hike. So I gave the difficulty of the Buffalo River Trail 5 stars because that's exactly what I'm looking for in a hike. For terrain, I define terrain as diversity in the walking surfaces, so not boring, and obstacles creating an interesting and challenging hike. So two basic things I'm looking at there: not walking on the same thing all day long, and having some obstacles to make it interesting. So the positive for the Buffalo River is that it had significant climbs. In the first 2 days, each day had at least 3 large climbs. There were multiple water crossings per day, which were enjoyable. Most of them you could just rock hop, but occasionally you had to take your shoes off, and I put on Crocs and went across with Crocs so that my feet wouldn't be wet all day long. They were enjoyable and none of them were dangerous, and to be honest, I loved taking my shoes off and getting my feet in the water. Just made them feel a lot better after miles of hiking. Obstacles like down trees and boulders required occasional use of hands, which I think keeps the trail interesting, but there weren't too many that it became monotonous. And it had many different trail surfaces: dirt, dry creek beds, boulders, water crossings, gravel, and stone staircases. The only negative I had on terrain was that one section between miles 6 and 9 on day 1 had a really large outslope. And it really gave my ankle troubles. And outslope is basically where the trail is slanted so that the water doesn't pool on it. And you have to have that, but I just felt like it was a little too sloped for me. Overall, I think the Buffalo River Trail was challenging, but not overwhelming, and I gave the terrain 5 stars. For exposure, that really depends on the person and whether they like it or not. I like being on the edge, so exposure is fine for me. I used a rating developed by wildandtrekking.com. Realize this isn't mountaineering definitions. They have a way more refined definition of exposure, and they have way more classifications than 5. But this is an easy way to look at exposure, and it basically depends on how far you are from the edge of a cliff. So a 1 would be no heights exposure, light exposure would be 10 feet away, moderate exposure would be 4 to 9 feet away, significant exposure is 2 to 3 feet away, and extreme exposure is when you're walking right next to the edge. From my perspective, the Buffalo River Trail rated as a 4. There are drop-offs, but they're a couple feet away, and none of them felt very dangerous. So that's my ratings on the difficulty of the trail, and next is the aesthetics. Okay, the next measurement is the measurement of beauty, and this is really subjective because everybody has their opinion about what beauty is. But for me, it's having not just the summit, but along the entire route, there's something to look at. There's different types of scenery. There's lookouts or heavily forested switchbacks, open valleys, meadows, creeks, waterfalls. Just all kinds of different features could make a trail beautiful. And I felt like what really made the Buffalo River Trail beautiful was the water. And whether it was the Buffalo River or the Cascades or the waterfalls, it just was the primary feature of the Buffalo River Trail. In addition, the diversity of the terrain throughout the trail enhanced the experience. Although there was very little foliage, color was not lacking in the trail. It had beautiful blue mountain views. The boulders were lime colored. There were evergreen trees, turquoise water, red rocks, and purple, yellow, and white wildflowers were abundant. I gave the Buffalo River 5 stars for beauty. The next measurement is of unique features, and again, I think the Buffalo River Trail had an abundance of those as well. The definition to me is what unique features set this trail apart from other trails. And the Buffalo River had, first of all, the abundance of waterfalls and cascades. I probably said that 10 times, but that really was Really, it was unbelievable to me. I've never been in a place that had so much water, and the beauty just really came through. The Cherry Grove Cemetery and the Adair Cemetery were cemeteries from the 1800s. There was a self-guided tour inside the Parker Hickman homestead that was built in 1847, and there were 4 different campgrounds a short hike from the trail. So that really gives you a lot of options as far as where you could stay if you need to stay in a campground. So overall, for unique features, I gave it the Buffalo River 5 stars. Okay, the next measurement is seclusion. And seclusion to me means that the trail doesn't cross roads or have heavy traffic noise. There shouldn't be any road walking, or if there is, very little. No residential areas. Occasionally running into other hikers is okay, but not crowds. For the positives for the Buffalo River, it doesn't cross any major roads. During our entire 37-mile hike, we only met 3 other hikers and a trail runner, and we saw a few kayakers, but really the kayakers don't bother me and the other hikers don't bother me. There weren't any crowds, and I think that was fine. There weren't any visible residential areas. The only drawbacks I felt on the Buffalo River as far as seclusion is concerned is you do have the potential to meet up with crowds or day hikers from campgrounds, because there's 4 campgrounds along the trail, and the traffic noise was occasionally present, so you could hear cars going up and down the road. And then you do have 2 sections that you have to walk on the road. It's a dirt road or gravel road, but there's a half a mile near the beginning of the trip, and then there's about a quarter of a mile on Cherry Grove Cemetery. Overall, that's just 2% of the entire hike. So I gave Buffalo River Trail 4 stars, just pulling 1 star back for the road walking and the road noise. Next measure is of camping locations, and this again is a subjective measure. Camping location doesn't mean there has to be a designated spot or a campground, but the trail should have locations that are flat and occurring regularly throughout it. If pre-existing campsites are available, they're neat and not overused, and the camping locations of the Buffalo River Trail were abundant. So positives for campsites at the Buffalo River Trail: it had many designated camp spots throughout the trail. Most of them had fire rings. Camping spots were easy to locate and tidy. I was really surprised by it, actually the whole trail, and we'll get to that later, but it was very well kept. There were 4 campgrounds with side trails leading to them, and you can also camp in non-designated areas. So pretty much all options are there for camping. I didn't have any negatives for camping, so overall 5 stars for camping availability. Next measurement is wildlife. This is a subjective measurement. Seeing wildlife throughout the trail enhances your trip, but I'll just say if I could see it in my backyard, it doesn't count. Sorry, squirrels. Wildlife on the Buffalo River Trail. So I have 2 categories on wildlife. One is ferocious animals, and then is other animals. So for ferocious animals, there were 0 bears, 0 mountain lions, and 0 poisonous snakes. And for other animal sightings, we saw 1 deer, 1 great blue heron on the ground, and he was injured, and it was kind of sad, but it was kind of neat to be able to see him so close. I'm sure if he hadn't been injured, he would have flown away. And then because of the lack of wildlife, I'm going to count a snail. So we saw a snail on day 2. Overall, for wildlife, it just wasn't very much. I don't know if it's because I'm noisy or if there isn't very much, but I gave it 2 stars on wildlife just because on my trip I didn't see much at all. The next measurement is availability of water. That means adequate water sources at manageable distances. The Buffalo Trail had an overabundance of water: streams, pools, cascades, river, creeks. It was just everywhere, and all of it seemed clean and filterable. Some of it looked crystal clear, like you didn't even have to use your filter. So 5 stars for water availability. The next measure is trail maintenance and markings. Trail maintenance means that it should be obvious where the trail goes, and that can be done through signage, cairns, blazes, and that they're appropriately spaced. And very few times should the direction of the trail be in question. The trail is well maintained, with blowdowns mostly limited to trunks, not having to crawl through the branches of a tree across the trail, and obviously no trace principles are observed. So on the Buffalo River Trail, the trail was extremely clean and neat. Leave no trace appeared to be practiced by all the other hikers. Rarely was there anything along the trail that shouldn't be there. Markings were appropriately spaced with white blazes and signage with arrows or BRT signs. I didn't have any negatives on maintenance and markings. I think the trail was well maintained. It was obvious most of the time where you needed to go, and I gave it 5 stars. So the Buffalo River overall rating is 4.5 stars. It's definitely a trail I want to revisit in the future. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my review of the Buffalo River Trail. If you want to see my entire through hike in an uninterrupted video, there's a link here for you to review it. Happy trails!